Aloha mai kako, a Kamamaita curtain call from a distance, a program of reviews, previews, interviews, and features of and or with the great art and artists on Maui and beyond. I'm Paul James Brown, and I'm coming to you from my home office where I have been conscientiously practicing self-isolation. Before I begin, I have to correct an omission from last week's show. When I reviewed Be Happy last week, I neglected to mention the artist. This was done by Tracy Dudley, who has another marvelous piece in the show that, just as Oliver Purves promised, has expanded. I apologize for not including his name, and go and check this show out. This week's show is a review of one of the most important books of 2020, one that sold almost 1 million copies the first day it was available. Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man by Mary L. Trump, Ph.D., is a tell-all expose of a dysfunctional American family, one member of which is the 45th President of the United States. I will refer to him as 45 throughout this review. I cannot hide my disdain for this person, and I suspected many of the things Dr. Trump's book confirms. Mary Trump has a doctorate in psychology. She is the daughter of Fred Jr., 45's eldest brother, and this book reads more like a memoir than a psychological textbook. But don't get me wrong, Dr. Trump reveals 45 as a narcissistic sociopath,
because lying, playing to the lowest common denominator, cheating, and sowing division are all he knows. He is incapable of adjusting to changing circumstances as he is of becoming presidential.
And she presents ample evidence to support her position. She begins with the patriarch of the family, Fred Sr., who fathered 5 children and, according to Dr. Trump, was responsible for Fred Jr.'s premature death at age 42 from alcoholism, brought on by his father's cruelty, caused by his disappointment in Jr.'s perceived failure to merit being his heir apparent. This gave the next son, 45, the opening to become the son his father wanted. He became the fair-haired boy who could do no wrong, no matter what the disaster. From the casinos in Atlantic City to the Plaza Hotel, far from being a successful businessman, 45 has a trail of failures.
Far from expanding his father's empire, everything Donald did after Trump Tower, which, along with his first project, the Grand Hyatt, could never have been accomplished without Fred's money and influence, chipped away at the empire's value. By the late 1980s, the Trump Organization seemed to be in the business of losing money, as Donald siphoned untold millions away from Trump management in order to support the growing myth of himself as a real estate phenom and master dealmaker. Over Donald's lifetime, as his failures mounted despite my grandfather's repeated and extravagant interventions, his struggle for legitimacy, which could never be won, turned into a scheme to make sure nobody found out that he's never been legitimate at all.
Dr. Trump points out the extreme cruelty to her family and other family members, and then in the end, she reveals 45's efforts to take advantage of his dying, demented father. She points out 45 is incapable of human empathy and perceives all the feelings we seek to instill in ourselves and our families: kindness, generosity, admitting when we're wrong, truthfulness, to name a few, as weaknesses only losers display. She names the person who 45 hired to take his SATs, Joe Shapiro. She said in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, this Joe Shapiro is not the one who was married to tennis legend Pam Shriver. She points out the only reason he went to Wharton School of Business was to get the name on his resume. He spent virtually no time there, coming home every weekend. What 45 is really good at, according to Dr. Trump, and the way he did business,
his hiring and treatment of undocumented workers and his refusal to pay contractors for completed work were assumed to be the cost of doing business. Treating people with disrespect and nickel and diming them made him look tough.
Her involvement in the 2018 New York Times expose of Fred Trump Sr.'s financial shenanigans was key to one of the longest investigative stories in the history of the New York Times that included evidence Fred Sr. dramatically undervalued his property to lower his tax bill. He is alleged to have padded virtually all maintenance invoices so Fred Sr. could list payments to his children as business expenses instead of taxable gifts. This tactic increased the rents they charged the low-income tenants in their government-subsidized housing developments, causing distress for these impoverished tenants. Dr. Trump suggests 45 perpetrated fraud on the American people when he vowed his father's wealth was his, then used this lie to create an inflated impression of his own success and ultimately made it the basis of his presidential campaign. She discusses how easy and dangerous it is to manipulate 45.
Over time, the vast bulk of the Republican Party, from the extreme right to the so-called moderates, either embraced him or, in order to use his weakness and malleability to their own advantage, looked the other way. After the election, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Mitch McConnell, all of whom bear more than a passing psychological resemblance to Fred, recognized in a way others should have but did not, that Donald's checkered personal history and his unique personality flaws make him extremely vulnerable to manipulation by smarter, more powerful men.
But she saves her heavy bombardment for today. Her assessment of 45's handling of the pandemic is devastating.
In 2020, his pandemic press briefings quickly devolved into mini campaign rallies filled with self-congratulation, demagoguery, and ring-kissing. In them, he has denied the unconscionable failures that have already killed thousands, lied about the progress that's being made, and scapegoated the very people who are risking their lives to save us despite being denied adequate protection and equipment by his administration. Even as hundreds of thousands of Americans are sick and dying, he spins it as a victory, as proof of his stunning leadership.
She indicts not only the sycophants who salaam 45's every move, no matter how ridiculous and dangerous, but the Republican Party that has enabled his basest notions and the American people who elevated him to a place that he is completely unfit to occupy. She concludes with this summation of 45's characteristics.
Donald has always been able to get away with making blanket statements. I know more about fill in the blank than anybody, believe me. Or the other iteration. Nobody knows more about fill in the blank than me. He's been allowed to riff about nuclear weapons, trade with China, and other things about which he knows nothing. He's gone essentially unchallenged when touting the efficacy of drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 that have not been tested, or engaging in an absurd revisionist history in which he's never made a mistake and nothing is his fault. It's easy to sound coherent and somewhat knowledgeable when you control the narrative and are never pressed to elaborate on your premise or demonstrate that you actually understand the underlying facts. It is an indictment, among many, of the media that none of that changed during the campaign when exposing Donald's lies and outrageous claims might actually have saved us from his presidency.
This book is so much more than John Bolton's. This brings us into the psyche of this charlatan, crook, and mendacious monster who has done more damage to the United States than any adversary ever could. She also shames all of us who have chosen this. I highly recommend this book. Dr. Trump is the narrator for the audiobook, and I cannot think of anyone who could read this with more understanding. Well, that's Curtain Call from a Distance for this week. Next week, I'll have my review of Kuya Estate chocolate tasting. Thanks for tuning into Curtain Call. I'm Paul James Brown. Ahui ho.